My name is Sophia, and like every little girl, I dreamt of a fairy tale wedding for as long as I could remember. The man I chose to spend my life with, Mark, seemed like a dream come true. He was a mechanical engineer, witty and kind-hearted. I was head over heels in love and saw my life unfolding like the storybooks said it would. Little did I know that my fairy tale would take a darker turn, starting on the very day meant to celebrate our love. Mark's parents, Jane and Roger, were traditionalists. They liked to keep things old-fashioned, which wasn't a problem in itself. The problem was that they had opinions on everything. I mean, they weren't shy about sharing. I was keen to make a good impression, but it seemed like the more I tried, the worse things got. The wedding ceremony was beautiful, set in an old cathedral with towering arches and intricate stained glass windows. I was getting ready in the bridal suite, nervous butterflies in my stomach when Jane and Roger walked in uninvited. Jane eyed me up and down and I saw her lips curl into a judgmental sneer. "Is this the best you could do?" she asked, gesturing at my wedding gown. "That dress makes you look chunky." I felt like someone had slapped me. I looked at Mark for support, but he uncomfortably shifted his gaze to the floor. "It's her day, Mom. Let her enjoy it," he finally muttered, clearly unwilling to challenge her more forcefully. Jane huffed. "Fine, but remember, you're marrying into this family. There are standards to uphold." Roger decided to weigh in. "We've always had tasteful weddings in this family. I hope you know how to keep a house better than you plan a wedding." "Enough, Dad," Mark said, but his voice lacked conviction. It was as though they had sucked the joy right out of him. At that moment I wanted to cry, but I took a deep breath, plastering a smile on my face. "Thank you for your input," I managed to say, my voice trembling. "I hope the rest of the day meets your standards." As they left, Jane threw one final jab. "We'll see. The bar's pretty high." The ceremony proceeded, but the atmosphere was tense. When I walked down the aisle, I saw mixed expressions, friends and family smiling warmly, while Jane and Roger looked on with barely veiled disdain. Every time our eyes met, I felt a shiver down my spine, as if they were dissecting me, judging my worthiness to be part of their family. Yet for the sake of Mark and the love I thought we shared, I pushed through it. The reception was another battleground. Jane and Roger critiqued every detail, my choice of flowers, the menu, even the music. They mingled with the guests, spreading their thinly veiled insults like wildfire. "So you're the lucky bride." One of Mark's aunts approached me, her tone condescending. "Jane told me you planned this all by yourself." "Brave girl." In that moment, I started to realize that the dream wedding I had envisioned was turning into a nightmare. And this was just the beginning. I looked at Mark, who seemed trapped between his loyalty to his family and his love for me. In that moment, I realized that my fairy tale was faced with dark undertones I had not seen before. Mark, who seemed trapped between his loyalty to his family and his love for me. In that moment, I realized that my fairy tale was laced with dark undertones I had not seen before. As the night drew to a close, I tried to focus on the happy parts. The way Mark looked at me when we exchanged vows, the cheer from friends who genuinely loved us. But it was impossible to shake off the sense of foreboding. I went home that night as Mrs. Sophia Harper, blissfully in love, and yet at the same time, painfully aware that the family I had married into would be anything but a fairy tale. It was my first inkling that I had just stepped into a life that was going to test me in ways I could never have imagined.
But as they say, forewarned is forearmed, and the experiences that lay ahead would steel me for the battles to come.
We moved into Mark's parents' house right after the honeymoon, a beautiful European getaway that briefly made me forget the ugly scenes that unfolded at our wedding. But the second we crossed the threshold of what was supposed to be my new home, it felt like we'd entered a realm where love and empathy no longer existed. It was a spacious, 4-bedroom house with plush furnishings and carefully chosen decor, but it might as well have been a prison cell. The first night there, as I unpacked my things, Mark's mother, Jane, walked into the room with her eyes narrowed. "Sophia, where are you planning to put all of these things?" she questioned, poking through my carefully chosen trinkets. "In our bedroom, of course," I answered, somewhat confused by the inquiry. Jane sighed dramatically.
Your clutter will simply ruin the aesthetic of the house. Maybe put them in the basement.
Hurt and bewildered, I decided to choose my battles and agreed. Alright, Jane, if it bothers you, I'll put them in the basement. A smug smile curled her lips.
Good, I'm glad you understand.
As if on cue, Roger, Mark's father, walked in with a list in his hand.
Here's a list of chores you'll need to take care of daily. We're not running a hotel here.
Stunned, I glanced at Mark, who seemed to sink into himself, trying to make himself smaller. Roger glared at Mark.
Having a job doesn't exempt her from contributing to the household. In this family, we believe in equal responsibilities.
Equal? I choked out the word. Jane doesn't work, and yet I'm the one given a list of chores?
I manage this household, which is a full-time job. You'll learn.
Days turned into weeks, and each day became an endurance test. I was entrusted with cooking, cleaning, laundry, and grocery shopping, all while holding a 9-to-5 job as a marketing executive. My professional life was excelling, but at home, I felt like Cinderella, minus the fairy godmother. During dinner one night, the tension reached a boiling point. I'd prepared a roast, careful to follow a recipe I found online to make sure it would meet the high standards Jane and Roger seemed to uphold. Roger took one bite and frowned.
Look at this. The meat is overcooked. It's like chewing rubber.
Jane chimed in.
Sophia, cooking takes practice. Obviously, you haven't had much.
Frustrated, I looked at Mark, silently begging him to intervene. My heart sank. There was no alliance here, no partnership where I felt supported. I was alone in a household that saw me not as a family member, but as an outsider, who needed to prove her worth to earn her place by their harsh standards. That night, as I lay in bed next to Mark, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of dread. I had willingly entered this house, naively believing love would be enough to get us through. But in this home, love was conditional, expectations were skewed, and I was the one who had to bear the brunt of it. And so I resolved that something had to change, either in this house or in my life. I couldn't go on like this, losing pieces of myself each day. But little did I know, things would get worse before they got better. The nightmare was only just beginning. After another grueling year at the house from hell, a glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon. Through sheer hard work and a few lucky breaks, I got promoted to the position of senior marketing executive at my company. With the pay hike, Mark and I started discussing the possibility of moving out into a house of our own. Mark seemed almost as excited as I was. I looked at him skeptically. Do you really think they'll let us go that easily?
Well, it's our life, right? They'll have to understand.
I looked at him skeptically. Do you really think they'll let us go that easily?
Well, it's our life, right? They'll have to understand.
I looked at him skeptically. Do you really think they'll let us go that easily?
Well, it's our life, right? They'll have to understand.
I looked at him skeptically. Do you really think they'll let us go that easily?
Well, it's our life, right? They'll have to understand.
I looked at him skeptically. Do you really think they'll let us go that easily?
Well, it's our life, right? They'll have to understand.
I looked at him skeptically. Do you really think they'll let us go that easily? Well, it's our life, right? They'll have to understand.
I looked at him skeptically. Do you really think they'll let us go that easily? Well, it's our life, right? They'll have to understand. Fueled by this newfound sense of possibility, we started house hunting. After weeks of searching, we found it, a beautiful, spacious home worth $1 million. It had everything we ever wanted. Large bedrooms, a garden, and even a little nook where I imagined setting up my reading corner. We were touring the house when I received a text from Jane. Where are you two? Dinner is getting cold. I showed Mark the message. See? They still want to control us. Mark sighed, once we have our own house, all this will change. You'll see. We took the plunge and bought the house. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. We moved in, filling our home with love, furniture that we picked out together, and yes, all of my clutter from the basement of my in-laws' home. It was a haven, a sanctuary from the oppressive environment I had been living in. At first, life was blissful. No more snide comments, no more endless chores. Mark seemed happier too, finally free from the relentless tension that permeated his parents' house. But the illusion of freedom shattered when, just 2 months into our life in the new home, We heard a knock on the door.
It was Jane and Roger, suitcases in hand.
Sophia, Mark. We've been thinking. Jane began, her tone deceptively sweet. We've decided that it's high time you sign over the house to us. We're older and wiser, and we can manage the finances much better than you youngsters can.
I felt my blood run cold. You want to move in? Roger spoke up. We're family, Sophia.
I looked at Mark, who appeared to be struggling internally. Finally, he spoke. Well, if you think it's for the best, Mom, Dad?
My heart plummeted. They moved in, and almost immediately, the old patterns reemerged. The critiques, the chores, the thinly veiled insults, it was as if we'd never left. The only difference was that this was my house, a place that should have been my sanctuary.
We bought this house, I argued one night after a particularly grueling day. But we're helping you manage it, Jane retorted. In fact, I think it's best if you sign it over to us. We know better how to handle a property of this value.
Mark stayed quiet, not meeting my eyes. That's when I knew. If I wanted to reclaim my freedom, my sanctuary, I'd have to fight for it. And fight I would.
Lying in bed that night, I realized I'd reached a breaking point. No longer would I play the docile daughter-in-law succumbing to their oppressive demands. It was time for a drastic change, one way or another. And so as the dark night loomed outside my window, plans started forming in my mind. I wasn't sure what lay ahead, but I knew one thing for certain. The old Sophia was gone. The new one was ready for battle.
The tension in the house was palpable. A thick fog that settled over everything, darkening even the sunniest rooms. My every move was scrutinized, my every action criticized. Yet something had changed in me. Every insult and every demeaning task became fuel for the fire that was slowly but steadily building within me.
One evening I was in the kitchen, peeling potatoes for a stew. My hands moved robotically, my mind elsewhere, weighing the options I had left. Divorce, legal action. As I pondered these life-altering choices, Jane waltzed in, a condescending smile on her face.
Sophia, we've been talking, she began, referring as always to her and Roger as a singular entity. We've decided that it's high time you sign over the house to us. We're older and wiser, and we can manage the finances much better than you youngsters can.
My grip tightened around the knife. Is that so? And what do Mark and I get in return?
Oh, you get to live here, of course, she said, as if she was granting me a massive favor. Under our roof, our rees.
Jane, this is my house, and I've had enough. It's time for all of you to leave, I finally snapped.
I could see her eyes widen with shock, then narrow into slits. How dare you speak to me like that? With a quick, fluid motion that belied her age, Jane raised her hand and slapped me across the face. A sharp pain radiated from my cheek, and when I touched it, I could already feel the skin swelling. A bruise would soon follow.
You will not disrespect me in my own son's home. Jane shrieked.
But the physical assault had a galvanizing effect on me. It was as if the fog had lifted, and I could see the situation for what it truly was. Intolerable.
I locked eyes with her. No, Jane, this ends now. This is my house, and it's you who has disrespected me for the last time.
Mark, who had been a silent observer until now, finally stepped in.
But I cut him off. Save it, Mark. Your time for choosing sides was long ago and you chose wrong.
That night, I slept in a separate bedroom. The physical distance was nothing compared to the emotional chasm that had opened up between me and the family I had once been so eager to join.
I called in sick at work the next day and spent the morning at a lawyer's office, setting into motion the legal wheels that would extricate me from this living nightmare.
It was a battle, yes, but it was also a reclamation. I was claiming back my life, my home, and my dignity.
The bruises, both physical and emotional, would heal in time, but there was one thing that would never recover. My relationship with Mark and his parents.
And so, armed with legal papers and bolstered by a newfound sense of purpose, I prepared myself for the courtroom.
As I looked at myself in the mirror, the bruise on my face standing out like a dark stain, I felt not shame or fear, but determination.
Enough is enough, I whispered to my reflection. Time to turn the tables.
And with that, I stepped out of the room, the click of the door echoing the finality of my decision. There was no turning back now. It was time for justice, and it was time for revenge.
The courtroom was a mix of cold sterility and weighted silence. I sat there, dressed in a tailored suit, the bruise on my cheek hidden under layers of makeup, but not forgotten.
Across the aisle sat Jane, Roger, and Mark. The looks on their faces were a mix of disbelief and indignation. They still couldn't fathom that I'd had the audacity to take legal action.
As the proceedings began, I felt my heart racing.
Let's get this straight, shall we? She began, her eyes flicking between me and Mark. This property was bought under both your names, correct?
Yes, Your Honor, Mark and I answered in unison.
And you, Mrs. Johnson, were physically assaulted in this property? She directed the question at me.
Yes, Your Honor. I have medical records and photographs to prove it, I said, my voice trembling slightly, but determined.
Is this true, Mrs. Williams?
I might have lost my temper, but that's no reason to take away our home.
Our home? The judge raised an eyebrow. I was under the impression it's not your home to begin with.
Well, we've been living there and our son is part owner, Jane argued.
That may be, but no one has the right to enact physical violence in any home, the judge cut in, clearly losing patience. And certainly not as a means to force someone into signing over property.
And certainly not as a means to force someone into signing over property. Then came the part we had all been waiting for. The verdict, taking into account the assault and the shared ownership of the house. I hereby rule in favor of Mrs. Sophia Johnson, the judge declared. In addition to granting the divorce, Mr. Mark Williams, Mrs. Jane Williams, and Mr. Roger Williams are to pay a compensation of $50,000 for the emotional and physical damages suffered by Mrs. Johnson. A wave of relief washed over me as though years of built-up stress had suddenly been lifted from my shoulders. Across the aisle, I saw Jane's face contort with rage, Roger's eyes filled with disbelief, and Mark. Mark looked at me, as if he was seeing me for the first time. After the proceedings, Mark approached me hesitantly. Can we talk? I looked at him, my eyes locking onto his for a moment, before I answered. There's nothing left to talk about, Mark. You had years to stand up for me, to stand up for us. But you chose your comfort over my dignity. It's too late now. So am I said. Sorry that I thought love was enough. It's not. Respect and dignity have to be there too. And your family showed me none of it. With that, I turned and walked away, the clacking of my heels on the marble floor punctuating the finality of it all. Justice had been served, and revenge had been had, not through schemes or plots, but through the legal system that existed to protect people like me from the abuses of those who believed they were above it. As I stepped out of the courthouse into the sunlight, I felt like I was emerging from a long, dark tunnel. My old life was over, but my new life was just beginning. A life that I would build on my own terms, without the weight of oppression and abuse. It was time for Sophia Johnson to rise from the ashes of her past. And rise I would,